That's wild. So we have some women that were fighters.
So that'll be a fun one to
mystery.
look at. Yeah.
It just means there has to be a part 2, right?
Yeah, so next week. What's going on, guys? Wade here, and I am with one of my great friends. She's one of the first people that I met when I moved to Des Moines, and she welcomed me to the community. And she's also responsible for the behind-the-scenes part of me sharing my story with you, so you get to thank her for that. She's a single mom of 4 boys. She's in her spare time a graduate student at a law school. She's the executive director of a nonprofit. And in her extra spare time, she's running for Congress. So Melissa Vine, did I get that right?
You did. Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. But we aren't here to talk about all of those things. We're here to talk about family history. And one of the things that you and I connected with was family history. And you had spent some time doing your own family tree at one point, and you had shared some of that with me. But what sort of inspired you to find out what your family history was all about? Was there some nostalgia involved?
Probably. I just also think it's really fascinating. And there's this piece too that is a curiosity. I think about like where I find threads from my past that I still see in our genes today. I always think that's interesting. I think too, looking at ancestry makes history come alive when you can put it in a context. I think that's super interesting too.
It's so fascinating to look at our ancestors and see their lived experience and how that applies to us today. And we can look back at our ancestors and say, who were they and what were they and what were their professions? And I think there's going to be some interesting things that you're going to find and excited for today. So Melissa, you shared your research with me, and then I took it and went down a rabbit hole. And so I think I've got some pretty cool stuff to share with you. So how about we start on your maternal side, your grandma Evelyn. And I know you have a close connection with her, and all she's passed away. But could you share a little bit of a story about her and what she meant to you and maybe some interesting things?
So Grandma Evelyn was the person in the world who showed me what unconditional positive regard looks like. Right? No matter how I came to her, she was there without judgment, without criticism. She was always a safe place for me to express my feelings or my concerns. And so when I think of Grandma Evelyn, it's a feeling, right? And then there are places, and I tie those places together with that feeling. So even though she lived in a double-wide mobile home and had very little money and would make us, box cake with canned frosting, like just being with her and being in that space, that was love. And I have a lot of treasured memories with her.
Funfetti is the best.
Yes.
That's amazing. She had a challenging upbringing, right? So she, I believe, was
an orphan.
And her parents lived through the Depression.
Yeah, and some of the siblings went to the orphanage and some of them were able to stay home. And then sometimes she'd get to go home over the summer. But I just think that would be really difficult to grow up and be like, oh, I have siblings who get to stay at home and I'm in an orphanage.
So Grandma Evelyn was in a foster home? Was this an orphanage or what was this?
Yeah, Grandma was in Soldiers and Sailors home. Yeah. So she was kind of feisty, right? And so she went back to the orphanage as an adult and with a friend, and they walked inside and they had put carpet down the hallways. And she said, oh, I'm so disappointed because I spent so many hours scrubbing the floors that used to be underneath this carpet, because every time she got in trouble, her punishment was to get on her hands and knees and scrub the floors. And now they covered them up. Yeah, so.
That's amazing. So I checked, and that home is no longer active. It's now taken over by the Indiana State National Guard, and it's being used as a residential facility for kids as well. And they have a program there, but what I found is that they have a cemetery on the property, and it was for individuals that were there at the home that may have passed away, because that orphanage was there for so long. And you have all different types of reasons for death, especially in the olden days. And I looked and it was in disrepair. So I've reached out to the Indiana National Guard. So if you guys, if there's somebody from the National Guard watching in Indiana, return my email, because you didn't yet. So I would love to go do some work out there in her honor. So
Wow.
Indiana National Guard, if you're out there, let me know. I'd love to come out there and work on that. So
That would be so special. Thank you.
very cool.
Yeah.
So great. So let's go back 2 more generations from her. And I'm going to show you a little video. Melissa, your maternal grandmother's line, the long line of Bale, and the individual that immigrated is Nicholas. He went by Nick, born in 1862, and he made the crossing from Denmark to the United States, arriving in Pennsylvania at the age of 20. In Denmark, he worked as a smith, so he was a metal worker, but we don't know exactly what kind, whether he was an iron worker or a silversmith, something like that, but a smith. From Pennsylvania, he traveled west to Iowa, where he married Sophronia Armstrong at the age of 23. She was buried next to him right here. She was born in 1861. The couple had 4 children. 2 were born in Iowa and 2 were born in Chicago, which is where she's originally from. So after a couple years in Chicago, the couple moved back to Chicago, which is where she's from, having 2 more children there, being closer with her family. In Chicago, he worked as a teamster, so he was driving a wagon. They were only in Chicago a couple years, and by their late 40s, they moved to Indiana, where they became farmers. Nick passed away from a stroke while he was milking cows for one of his neighbors. You've got quite a history coming from Denmark. So you've got Nick from Denmark, and I looked, and where they came from, it's a beautiful seaside town in Denmark, and so you'll definitely have to take your boys and visit sometime. It's gorgeous, but you come from a family of hard workers.
Wow, thank you.
Absolutely.
That's really special. And I think because of the circumstances in which my grandma grew up, she didn't know a lot about her family history, so there wasn't much that she had to share because she was a bit disconnected from her family. So
Grandma Evelyn didn't have an opportunity to be raised by her parents directly. You know, so you certainly saw them over the summer months, and she certainly would have had influences there at the home. And let's hope that they were some very positive influence as well, even though she might have rebelled a little bit. But you've got 4 boys of your own, and they've been with you for plenty of years. And how as a parent do you think about raising them and teaching those lessons in history about that hard work and contributing to society?
I think when they're kids, you associate hard work with reward. And so finding ways to reward hard work instills that kind of ethic in them. And so then eventually they learn to appreciate hard work just for the feeling you get after you do hard work, right? But I think we have to train kids up to be into that space. And they are hard workers. They're all little entrepreneurs, so. Yeah.
That's amazing. So let's stay on your maternal line and let's look over at the Gaster family. So I'm going to give you a book with some things. You can follow along as I tell you to go through and open the pages up. So you can open up to the first page now.
Okay. It's a blank slate.
That's right. And there's nothing there. There is no Gaster family.
Oh.
This is Peter Gaster. He is your second great-grandfather who was born in Illinois. We find him in the 1900 census living in Iowa. He had just married his wife Caroline, and that's the document that you see there in your book, is the marriage record in the state of Iowa. And they were newlyweds. In 1900 census, they were newlyweds. They had I believe a 9-month-old baby at home at the time of that census document. And he's listed in the 1900 census as a drayman. And the drayman is a driver of a team of horses, typically without sides on it. So you can think of maybe delivery wagons. That's what his job was in the 1900 census.
Wow.
So he had a little baby at home, a couple-month-old baby, a brand new wife Carolyn, and they were living in Iowa.
Huh. Interesting.
Do you know much at all about the Gaster family? You mentioned your grandfather at all?
He died when I was young.
Yeah.
And I honestly didn't know anything beyond, beyond that.
They were a little tricky to find. They were a little tricky with it. And sometimes records are really great, but we do know that the family, settled in Iowa, like most of your ancestors, but they came from other places before that. So go ahead and turn the page.
Okay. Ah.
What country do you see there on the page?
France?
France. So let's look at his wife's Caroline. So Caroline was born here in Iowa, but her parents were French. They came over from France, and they were living in the region around Strasbourg, which is called Alsace. So it's right along the German and French border. I've got it marked there for you with a nice pretty dot. So you've got a little French in you.
Oui, oui.
Yeah, yeah. So you have a Jean in there. You have, but then you also have many German names or Germanic sounding names, because in that particular region of France, because it is on the German border, you have a lot of shared culture. Culture. I've been there. It's gorgeous. You'll have to go.
Okay.
It's amazing. Go ahead and turn the page.
All right.
So as I said, I found the Gasters to be a little challenging. But if we look back 3 generations, we can find them in Bedford, Pennsylvania. It's a very rural area, and we can trace them to 1747. In 1747, John Henry Gaster was renting 2 acres of land from an individual. It had a house, it had a secondary structure of some sort on it, and it was valued at $410.
Ooh.
And that was in 1798. He was born 1747, and in that time, he was living there in 1748. And that's the document that you see here. You see his name there on that line that says Henry Gaster, along with all that information.
Wow. It's very cool. The handwriting is so pretty.
Isn't it amazing?
Wow. Wow. And the way things are spelled, dwelling houses.
Absolutely,
Houses.
absolutely. So, Melissa, we had you take a DNA test. And as I mentioned, there is a little French that we can definitely trace, and we can definitely find out a lot of other information from the traditional genealogy that's been done. But I'm going to show you a little video here about your DNA results.
Only 9%. Interesting.
Does it surprise you at all?
The Scandinavian is the highest.
Yeah, it's
is
Denmark.
interesting. That's that Denmark.
And how did you pronounce the last name? It's
Bali?
Bali. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Wow.
that's where that comes from.
Interesting.
So the Scandinavian, we certainly know because we've already talked about the Bali family, and that's Denmark. And so Denmark is certainly covered within that region. But what we also see here is North and West European, which frankly, that's a large area, right? So we can make some assumptions that there's going to be some of the French that we just learned about that's in there. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is Iberian. It is our 3rd most in terms of percentage, and that's the Iberian Peninsula. That's Spain, Portugal, and in that area. And certainly we're going to look at these pools as not being country specific, but regional. But I cannot find in your traditional genealogy anyone from that. Isn't something out there? It just wasn't something that I was able to uncover using my traditional searches with the lines that I traced.
Yeah. Interesting, huh?
So that'll be a fun one to
mystery.
look at. Yeah. Yeah.
It just means there has to be a part 2, right?
So, so next week, we'll put a pin in this for next year this time.
Like and share this post to hear part 2.
Like and share, everyone. Like and share. So Eastern European is the final one that's listed there. So let's continue on. So we're going to switch over to your paternal line now. And let's talk about Grammadoris. So Grammadoris is from the turtle family. And I mispronounce that a lot, but I'm going to share a video with you. And we're going to talk about the turtle family and where they came from.
Melissa, I'm here in Milford, Connecticut, where your paternal grandmother's line started, the Terrell family. Your grandmother Doris's maiden name is Terrell, and your 10th great grandfather is Roger Terrell. Roger was born in London, England in 1612 and came to the United States via the ship the Lion, arriving in Boston. He was in Boston and Roxbury for a number of years before traveling to Western Connecticut, likely during the Pequot War. Records indicate that he had been turned away from a number of different settlements here in Connecticut, but ultimately was accepted into the Milford settlement, and ironically, by one of my ancestors, William Fowler. William Fowler was one of the founders of Milford. And so your ancestor Roger and my ancestor William would have known each other here and been living together in this area at that time. Now, your ancestor, Roger Terrell, is indicated here on this stone along with his wife, Abigail. He's on this side of the street, whereas my ancestor, William Fowler, is right over there. Your ancestor, Roger Terrell, along with his wife, Abigail, are indicated here on this stone, on this memorial bridge, because he doesn't have a burial location that's currently marked. Many of the earliest settlers here don't have grave markers, including William Fowler for myself. Roger also doesn't have a grave marker. In the early days of this town, the burials took place in garden settings, and so there's no markers that exist for many of the original settlers of this area, including my ancestor William and Roger and Abigail for you.
That's wild. Literally across the street from each other.
So I loved finding that story. So coming over from England and, during colonial period, and you've got all of these settlements that are popping up. So
wow.
So we knew each other.
That's wild.
Even back then. So to me, wild world. So our ancestors 400 years ago, and now we live down the street from each other.
That's crazy. Yeah. Very cool.
So let's take a look at where they went from Connecticut.
Yeah.
From the early days in Milford, Connecticut, where many generations of the Terrell line lived, the story continues here, just outside of Cleveland, Ohio, with Ichibod and Rhoda. The couple, along with his brother and his father Oliver, traveled here in 1810. Father Oliver was known to be very spry, rode horseback the entire way, and was 80 years old when he arrived here. Ichibod himself was an attorney. You'll see the Esquire name after this. I'm sure you can appreciate that, Melissa, being a law school student. So, prominent member of the community, well-liked. And on the back side is Rhoda. Let's take a look at her. On the reverse of the stone, we have Rhoda Williams, the wife of Ichibod, in memory of Rhoda Williams, wife of Ichibod, died 85 years old. Her story was that she was a survivor of the Wyoming Massacre. There was a battle during the Revolutionary War. Many of the patriots were killed during that conflict. She was the daughter of Roger Williams and a survivor of the Wyoming Massacre. The couple had 10 children, and one of their sons, Philander, moved to Mantua, Iowa, later in his life. So how do we get to Iowa, where you live? This couple had 10 children, and one of their sons, Philander, moved to Mantua, Iowa later in his life, and that's likely the connection as to where he met some of your other ancestors.
Wow.
Did you ever learn about this family line from Grandma Doris?
No, not much.
Yeah. It's a really interesting story to see them all the way from Milford in Connecticut and then carrying on Cleveland, Ohio. And the Wyoming Massacre that was referenced there on her tombstone, Wyoming refers to the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. And so you had British troops that were having battle or basically putting siege on a fort that was in that area. And there were settlers that were there. Men and boys came out from the fort to meet the British soldiers on the battlefield. That didn't go very well, and that battle continued, and a lot of individuals escaped out into the woodlands that were in the area, and many simply died from starvation. They were fleeing their homes to begin with, the fort, and lost the community that was built up around them to support them.
Wow.
And so, really big deal for her to be able to survive that and continue on.
Yeah. So we have some women that were fighters.
Boss ladies, right? We've talked about this, but incredibly challenging for women in that era. We think about it being challenging for men as well, but the lost story for so many is the women. You know, we look at records and how male dominated they are. So frequently we'll see, you know, records that will say, and sometimes we can't even find out who the woman was because it will simply be Mrs. male name and last name. And so we don't have that. But, you know, as a woman who's, you know, executive director, law school, running for Congress, you know, what does it mean to be a strong woman now and the challenges that you have, that you face, thinking about your ancestors and going through the Wyoming massacre and those challenges? They're very different challenges, but encouraging women to be strong.
I find it to be a gift to be able to say out loud the things that my ancestors used to have to say in private. So things I can put on social media or say to a crowd about women's rights or advocating for women are things that were hushed in corners, right? Lots of secrets kept. Lots of women who had to suffer in silence, and there really wasn't a remedy, right? So for example, if you were in an abusive relationship, it would have been an economic disaster to try to flee from that, you know. But I had the privilege of getting out of domestic violence and being able to find work for myself and get a degree and another degree and build up this life that is so amazing and something I never dreamed I would get to live, with so much freedom and responsibility. And I wake up every day with a ton of gratitude and just energy and excitement about what's next, because I'm living this life that I never dreamed would be possible. And for so many of my female ancestors, it truly wasn't possible. It was more difficult for me to get on this path as a woman, but it was possible.
It's so powerful. Melissa has an amazing story. You should really check her out. Her story, she's talking about it here, she's hinting at it, but an individual that got out of a very challenging marriage and really into poverty and bringing yourself back up and to be where you are now is just sheer determination. You had to work your butt off to get where you are now. So you can see why Melissa and I became friends. There's a reason for that. I just seeing her story and seeing that and just the tremendous respect that I have for her and for her story. And you can see, you know, I shared it earlier. There's a reason that a person like this gave me confidence to come out and share my story with you, because there's certain people that come into your life that are inspirational, and Melissa's really one of those people.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's turn to the next line and talk a little bit more about some of the ladies.
All right.
So we're going to stay on your paternal line, and we're going to go over to the Tomatish family. And you can go ahead and turn your page. This is a wedding photo of your great-grandparents. This is George and Mildred. Her name was Milka, and she went by Mildred. Both immigrated to the United States from present-day Croatia. And that's where we see that Eastern European DNA component. So this is where we can trace that. George arrived in 1911 and Mildred in 1920. And I think you told me a story about having met Mildred when you were young. Do you remember that?
Yeah. So I believe she passed away when I was maybe around 4 years old. So I do have a vague memory of her. But more memorable is when I was older and listened to a recording of her being interviewed. And on that recording, the interviewer was asking her, you know, did you marry for love? And she laughed. And she was like, well, honey, you married to survive. So, you know, it was just a very, it's a very different perspective on why to get married than we have today. So
thank you for sharing that. That is something that is so overlooked in historic contexts. We look at what it takes to survive and the challenges that people faced. And this is the last bit of nuggets that I was able to find. And this one goes way back. So we know that the Tomatish family came from Croatia. And I was able to trace the family back to a birth record dated March 20th, 1732. And it's for your fifth great-grandfather, Antonium. So what you're seeing on here is his birth record written in that native language from Croatia from 1732,
Wow.
indicating his parents were Nikolai and Helene, and they were from the province of Reška in Croatia, present-day Croatia. Beautiful area.
Oh, I've seen pictures.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Croatia is beautiful.
Where are you going to take your boys first to travel? So we've got France, we've got Croatia, we've got
I
Denmark.
feel like we're just like planning our next international vacation here,
There's lots to pick from.
right?
It's amazing. Well, thank you, Melissa, for opening up your house and your family with me, because this is certainly very personal information, and I hope you learned something new about your family and can take that and treasure it with your own boys and as you pass that along to them.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. This is really a gift, so thank you.
Absolutely.